that is the dirty little secret that the businesses are trying to mystify themselves as friends and family, and all the legitimacy that comes from your social connections. And it's just horseshit. The missing element so far has been this mutual self-awareness that we can create a different world. And to the extent that the social media platforms can help give us the sovereignty of we the people that we have nominally but not actually, then we can start to build in the proper directions and have more of a cultural awareness that, hey, we can do this.
Hi, Rabble.
Hey, Alice.
So this week we have a very esteemed guest in David Bollier, somebody that I know you have enjoyed talking to a lot in the past, and looks at this whole space from a very different perspective. So before we take a listen today, and I know you'll share a little bit more about your history with David, can you just explain for our listeners, what is the Commons?
In this podcast, we've been talking about the movement to build social media protocols, to create an alternative to the shopping mall of corporate Facebook and the state control of an authoritarian regime like China. Now, when you think about this alternative, what you have as an alternative to state and private ownership is the Commons. So in this podcast, I wanted to talk to David Bollier, who is the preeminent researcher, academic, advocate, and author talking about the Commons, where we look into what is the Commons, how does its role play in creating a space which is valuable to the people who are participants, but what isn't owned by any particular person. And so what we see with open source software or Linux or Wikipedia are the Commons, and what we see with podcasting is a social media commons. And so his work describes this age-old alternative system for how people get together and organize themselves. That is the Commons.
And I think the really interesting thing about David is, as the grandfather of the Commons, if you will, he was really starting to talk and write about the Commons before Twitter was invented. And then along came this new form that disrupted a lot of thinking and behavior around the Commons too.
Yeah, absolutely. His work started out studying how people in Japan maintained forests in common, how, the water systems of Valencia, Spain worked on a commons-based system. And then as the digital revolution took hold, people discovered the Commons, and they realized that this model that had been around for hundreds of thousands of years of how humanity organized itself before there was a state, before there were markets, applies to the digital world.
It's really fascinating too to pick up on where Rudy Fraser a couple of weeks ago was talking about mutual aid, right? I mean, these are all very connected philosophies and ideas. Let's take a listen.
When I think about the future of social media, we have to have a model that works, and a model that isn't state control like we have in China, or a model that isn't just a few large corporations controlling our speech. And there's nobody better at articulating this alternative model for how we can organize ourselves than David Bollier, who is an activist, academic, researcher, media creator on the Commons. He's the author of many books about the Commons. Think Like a Commoner is one of the ones that jumps to mind, and the creator of the Frontiers of Commoning podcast, helped create Public Knowledge, helped create Creative Commons, and has been a real thinker and advocate for this model of a commons. So I'm so excited to have you on my podcast, David.
I'm looking forward to the conversation.
A bunch of years ago, I sat down with some people and I was trying to explain how I thought social media or the internet should work. And I was like, it shouldn't be a shopping mall, and we shouldn't just have the government run everything. And this person said, there is a model there, it's the Commons. And I'm like, the Commons, it's that thing that has the tragedy. It doesn't work. It's this open space where we just give it over to anyone and then it gets exploited. And I'm wondering if you could start off by just talking about what is the commons and where does the idea come from?
Well, I would say that the commons is as old as humanity. It's kind of the default setting for coordination and governance. It's just in the past 200 years or so, we've tricked ourselves into thinking that we're isolated individuals and that the social context and the earth is irrelevant. And I think climate change and a lot of other things are showing us that we're in fact interdependent, interconnected social creatures. And we're rediscovering that, but we don't quite have the vocabularies, the concepts, and we've lost our cultural memory about that past. I think it's kind of in our genes. There's a lot of instincts, but we haven't developed it as much as the grand edifice of standard free market economics, for example. So a lot of my work on the commons is about explaining through examples. Here's a successful water commons, urban commons, digital commons, local commons, and so forth, in which cooperation for mutual benefit with bounded markets that are socially accountable may be functioning, maybe not. That's maybe part of the confounding nature of the commons, that it's so varied and I would say even ontologically different from the premises of standard economics and the modern state, that it's hard for people to wrap their minds around it or think that it's real or serious.
This idea that the only way to have things run is either via private ownership or the state is actually a new idea that is being introduced. And if you look back at history, most of the time, human economic activity, human social activity is coordinated through these ideas of a commons. There isn't a single arbitrary owner who has sovereign power over it. What I think is fascinating is how it feels like this radical idea that somehow if it isn't owned, then how could it possibly work?
How could it be consequential? How could it create things?
Yeah.
How could we manage ourselves? I mean, I think part of this is the extreme nature that capitalism has gone in the past 50 or 75 years, in which neoliberalism has become so ascendant, so totalistic, that the idea of a mixed economy driven by social needs or ethical concerns is like hopelessly quaint by today's standards. And, in the 50s and 60s, the idea that GDP was the measure of everything was really hadn't taken root as much. It was kind of just one of those metrics out there. And so I think that we're, in this time, 2025, trying to escape this rather suffocating mental construct, social construct, political and economic construct. And I think the strange thing is there are all sorts of real life commons out there functioning right now. They're just not culturally legible. We don't have the vocabularies for talking about them. We haven't found each other and horizontally organized them yet. So that's the struggle that I've taken on, that a lot of other commoners have taken on.
So I wonder if you could sort of talk about some of the examples of commons that exist and what they do and how they meet people's needs, how they meet their economic needs, because a commons isn't a thing without economic activity. A commons isn't a thing where you don't engage in business and make money.
Well, there are engagements with the market. They're just not capital driven and extractive and predatory. So, for example, open source software, as we know, is a non-capitalist way of creating valuable stuff. It meets needs. It withdraws from the standard circuits of capitalism until capitalism captures or co-opts it in some way, which it has in some cases. There can be market activity, but as many open source communities know, introducing money and transactionalism into that community can poison relationships, can start to erode the community. And so there's a certain trickiness to dealing with money in a commons, because a transactional relationship is very different from a collective commitment pooling. We're going to do this together. We have different talents. We're going to contribute them in different ways. We're not going to monetize them. We're not going to quantify them necessarily. We're going to work together. And that's maybe kind of an alien concept unless you're trying to get a corporate team together or something. But in fact, there's a lot of people who find a lot of purpose and meaning and belonging and community through commoning. And that's not a market behavior to maximize capital accumulation or profit. So I know that's a rather heterodox idea in today's norms, but I think there's a deep yearning and desire and actual enactments of that in all sorts of contexts. And I could mention, you asked for some examples. Let me just name a few. Obviously, in the digital spaces, there's quite a few, from the famous ones like Wikipedia and open source. A lot of the backbone of the internet is based on a lot of these types of software commons. But, it's in nature. The global south, an estimated 2 billion people depend upon commons of forest, fisheries, irrigation water, wild game, all sorts of things like that, as part of their everyday existence. Yet economics doesn't regard it as interesting or significant because there's no money changing hands necessarily, except at the margins. I mentioned a lot of other emergent commons like urban spaces, for example. There's a lot of, there's no inventory. They can happen anywhere. I know community solar commons where they put the money generated by solar into a trust, use that revenue for community purposes. And, there's a lot of different variations, but they generally depend upon some inalienable shared asset, something that can't be sold, so that it can be the anchor and sort of the focal point for that community. And then there's all sorts of dynamic social relationships for cooperation, for ritualizing togetherness, for forging shared purpose, for sharing knowledge, for having gentle reciprocity with each other that helps keep the commons together as a coherent social organism.
One of the things that I think is so fascinating is when we were working on creating what became podcasting, what became Twitter, we had this idea that the humanity, the human connection and what we were doing socially has existed for a long time. We were just attempting to adapt it to this new sets of technologies. And a purely neoliberal economic vision says the financialization is the only thing that matters, and that humans are essentially rational economic beings. And that doesn't coincide with our understanding of how people work. It doesn't understand it with science and research into behavioral economics. It doesn't coincide. But if you were to think about it that way, you would think that these ways of social regulation don't work, and they do work. In the case of open source, you have all of the internet built on essentially a set of freely contributed technology platforms, and the companies are just these thin layers on top of it.
I think the problem is that many businesses and markets don't understand that they're actually dependent on social trust, collaboration, and a lot of other social factors, but they're so intent on monetizing them, capitalizing them, privatizing them, that they don't want to give it their due. We saw how the music industry virtually committed suicide by trying to put digital rights management around everything and prevent the social sharing of music, that they basically were choking on by not having enough social interaction undergirding their markets. Similarly, the public domain, fair use, and now Creative Commons licenses to allow illegal sharing have sort of opened up the space for creativity that requires that kind of unmetered, non-propertized exchange. And so there's a functional necessity for that, but I would go further and say Commons are value generating organisms themselves and have the capacity to out-cooperate market players. That requires, there's some complications to be met there, most notably in acquiring the capital assets or infrastructures to enable those commons to grow and to protect themselves, because they're supremely vulnerable to what's called enclosure, the privatization and commodification of those resources, which of course any business loves to do because it's seen as a gimme, a free resource. You know, economists say there's no such thing as a free lunch. Well, yeah, commons are free lunch all the time for market players. So one of the key imperatives of a commons is to have the preemptive ways of protecting itself legally, technologically, or socially.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fascinating. You're talking about two different things. One, how do we get the capital and the resources to create it at the beginning? And this is something I saw with the emergence of social media in the late 1990s and early 2000s with open source technology and blogging and the emergence of podcasting, where we didn't have much capital and we didn't have the ability to accumulate capital and invest it. And so I was involved with this movement called Indie Media, and we set up media activist centers in 180 cities all over the world. And you could go in and you could record a podcast, do a live radio stream, edit stuff, print a zine, a newsletter, publish stuff on the internet. And we went to protests all over the world, and we taught people how to make media before social media became a thing. But we had no way to raise money. We had no way to fund it. Like, the entire network was funded with a $100,000 grant from Chumbawamba when they sold one of their songs for an advertisement. And then some of us who are on the tech side said, well, what if we worked with some of the venture capitalists, worked with some of the startup folks, worked with some of the folks in San Francisco and said, we'll use your resources to build this thing that we had been building without resources. And we had a momentary time from about 2005 to 2010 where you had corporations who were taking venture capital money and building out a commons that emerged with Web 2.0 with social media, and yet didn't initially enclose it. They sort of ran the infrastructure, but they ran it in an open way because we were trying to cultivate this open system. And then over time, in some of those social media platforms that emerged, the companies said, well, we're not going to be so open. We're going to shut down all these open apps and you have to ask for permission and our servers control it. And then in one of these, it didn't happen, and that's podcasting. Podcasting ended up staying this open commons. And now, there's no big company you go to talk about podcasting. There's no Facebook or Instagram, but it's ubiquitous, and anyone can go and they can start a podcast and they can build an audience and they can reach it, and you control your podcast feed. And you yourself started and run a podcast. It's a major way in which you're reaching an audience in addition to books. As someone who both researches this stuff and participates in it, I'm curious what the experience is when you've gone through publishing and creating a podcast versus writing books that you had to go through editors and publishers and distributors.
Well, I mean, there's like 5 questions embedded in that, what you just said. But one of them is, of course, having open competitive markets that are not rolled up by capital and I might add, to use Cory Doctorow's term, enshittified, in which the business model is trying to capture value from the users and then from the businesses and then from the shareholders. It's essentially destroying the model over time rather than benefiting everybody, because that's what capital does. The alternative that I see, I think that podcasting is in some ways an aberration of historical circumstances, that it's remained as open as it has. The early internet had the protocols for distributed peer sharing and the ethic of a gift economy that they took from the academic world. They did not preemptively anticipate how it might be commercialized the way it was from 1994 on when the web was introduced. And I mean, I think that was kind of the fatal flaw, along with the conflation of an open platform with the commons, because they're not the same. An open platform, somebody can just go in and capture it, use their market power, or simply buy it out, to the way Google has done to try to take over the social value that has been generated by commenting. And so I think there's a divide between these open platforms, which can be turned into markets, can be rolled up, can be consolidated, versus commons, which are trying to maintain their social integrity and generativity without it simply being monetized and consolidated. So that sort of states some of the structural and cultural challenges of protecting commons going forward. I mean, for me, the paradigmatic example is how couch surfing, which started as this international hospitality gift economy, needed to expand, had server expenses, fell into the hands of venture capitalists and became a travel service, not so different from many other travel services, and lost this really kind of beautiful ethic, which was, people could affordably stay in major cities through this kind of gift exchange. So, I mean, I don't want to fetishize that, but I do want to say it points to the need for common sources of finance and self-protection.
No, and then the couch surfing example is amazing because, I use couch surfing. I was a host for many years, and it had this thing where the creators of couch surfing are like, how do we make this thing work? How do we sustain it? We've created this thing of a lot of value. And then they ended up taking investment, and then it ended up being captured by these investors. Now, a group of people who were on couch surfing decided that they didn't like what happened there. And so they created an alternative called Trust Routes, which is an alternative couch surfing network. And a few years ago, the Trust Routes people said, well, what happens to us? Like, are we going to make the same mistake as couch surfing? Are we going to say, how do we keep the servers running? How do we keep this funding? And so they actually came to the Nostr community, who are building these open social protocols, and said, well, what if we took Trust Routes, this couch surfing like sharing platform, and rebuilt it on a permissionless open social protocol? And so they're in the process of rewriting Trust Routes so that it runs on the Nostr open social protocols, so that it precisely doesn't have the problem that happened with couchsurfing, so that it isn't owned by just one person or the creator, but it is sort of held in common by the community of users who are hosts and guests in it. And like that little decision between do we fund it by going and asking the Nostr community for a grant to rewrite it and building an economic model where we can fund this stuff, or do we go to venture capital and put ourselves vulnerable? At the moment, it's a teeny decision, but it leads to very different worlds.
Yes, because going with conventional capitalist investment is essentially letting outsiders dictate what the inside of your enterprise is going to look like. You need to be hierarchical. You need to be productivity driven. You need to get maximum market revenue. And you start to bleed out all the interesting idiosyncrasies and relationships that generate creative stuff, which, Oracle or Microsoft couldn't have generated Linux. It required this bizarre community of misfits to be able to be that creative. And it needed the open space, the breathing room, along with, of course, some nutrients like money and computers and other things. I think what you described, though, scants on the need for genuine in-person social commitment. And you can only build so much into the legal structure or the code. You also need the personal culture and ethic to be nourished. And this was a lesson that I especially learned more recently with Will Ruddock, a currency designer in Africa, who has studied indigenous communities and traditional communities and realized that devising an alternative currency for them would simply become another transactional medium unless they had a substrate of social trust and commitment. He called it commitment pooling. So whatever is created has to have this kind of social infrastructure too. I'm reminded of Nathan Schneider, a professor at University of Colorado Boulder, who wrote a book called Governable Spaces. And he says, his mother's garden club is better at self-governance than a lot of digital communities. And it's because they take seriously their relationships with each other and don't have the conceit that they can simply design this into the code and that'll take care of it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, there's this technological solutionist idea that somehow if we just embed all of the rules and the dynamics and everything into the technology, that the code as law doesn't need the human implementation of it and the social dynamics, and we are social creatures. We don't exist outside of our social constructs.
And we see how a lot of the governance of in the Bitcoin and crypto world is kind of a recursive phenomena. You may have a so-called trustless system, which is in some crude ways, trustless, but in other ways it backs up into social disagreements and schisms. And, you need to have relationships. You need to discuss this stuff. You need to develop cooperation and trust. There's no way around it.
And sort of tapping in on a little bit of stuff going on in the Bitcoin ecosystem. Right now, there's a big fight between these group called Knots and Bitcoin Core, and they're trying to decide where Bitcoin goes. And it's couched in a very technical description of like how many characters you can put in an OPSEC, like verification of new Bitcoin blocks and everything else. But the truth of the matter is, the conflict and the way it's getting resolved is a social conflict, and it's a how do we govern this space? And so even though Bitcoin is this paper that has existed for, since 2008, and it's a set of technology and it's this dynamic, there is a social governance layer on there deciding how they're going to work. And it is a mistake to ignore that part of which they are governing. And, Bitcoin is a commons.
Absolutely. Or it is the resource is a common pool resource. Arguably, it doesn't have a commons yet as a social system. But I mean, the point is well taken. That's definitely a work in progress in terms of managing of a shared resource.
I would love to talk a little bit more about the currency design stuff, because one of the projects that I have been working on and people in the open protocol community have been working on is a new eCash implementation called Cashew. And this is a sort of a revival of the pre-Bitcoin ways of digital cash. And you have these, there's a whole way in which the math works and everything else. But essentially, instead of a single universal currency, the way Bitcoin works, you have these mints, which are essentially community banks. And you have trust in that community bank, that mint server. And within there, you can make all sorts of transactions and digitally, you have to have that trust. And so it is essentially reviving that trust infrastructure that you see with local currencies or community currencies in like, the Ithaca dollar, or in African communities or people who do susus, saving collectives. What lessons should people designing these new digital solutions like Cashew and these new mints, these new things, learn from the commons community, learn from the history that needs to be built into this technology? Or its implementation, not just the technology.
The implementation, maybe that's where I get out of my job description, because I think there's a lot of technical aspects to it. I do think one goal of having it bounded and rooted in a place or a distinct community rather than a globally interchangeable currency is valuable, because, I see bioregionalism as a new framing for saving the earth as a really important thing. But are bioregions going to simply become neo-colonial extraction zones for a global currency? That would be tragic, because I think there needs to be bioregional autonomy that's crafted to the landscape and the culture and the people and so forth. And that's where local currencies could come in as a bounded phenomena. I work with the Schumacher Center for New Economics. It has the Berkshires in Western Massachusetts, which is for now, paper currency that is accepted by scores of different businesses with the help of some banks that help clear the money. I think that is an example of how you can foster local and regional economic development without the money and financing being siphoned away to the big financial centers, and to having, the multiplier effect locally, and then to have the trust factor as well. That it's, the money can be socially steered in certain directions. It's not just seen as this seemingly impersonal, amoral, medium for creating value. It can be compatible with the commons as a non-monetized, non-propertized form of value creation. So, those are some general ideas I would have. Implementing, I defer to some of the progressive experts on that.
For folks who are interested in more, who are the experts? Who should we be looking to?
Well, I don't travel extensively in those circles, but I mentioned Will Ruddock, who recently wrote a book. He's with a group called Grassroots Economics that he helped found. He wrote a book that's available as a PDF, I believe by that title, which helps explain some of his ideas, and he has a Substack. I know there's Mary Mellor, who's a British academic, has written well on this topic. Until he passed, Bernard Lataire, of course, wrote great stuff on this. In some ways, I'm less interested in the theory than having people who can do implementations. And that requires not just the great design, it requires essentially being a community organizer, helping to develop the network, helping to get the circulation going, helping to develop the trust in it, helping get various types of institutions, civic and commercial, to buy into it. So that's a nut that hasn't been cracked yet, and I'd love, to find the new organizer or Johnny Appleseed for that.
One of the people I've interviewed and have been working with is Rudy Fraser, who is the creator of Black Sky. And he has created this system that's in the Blue Sky ecosystem, except you can use Black Sky usernames, Black Sky domain names, Black Sky servers, and algorithms and moderation. And essentially, it is a community-controlled system where you said the African-American community, the Black community in the US wants its own technology, its own servers. But the interesting thing about Rudy is he comes to that work through being a mutual aid organizer, through working in a project called Paper Tree, which was about creating community-funded local systems in Bushwick, in Brooklyn, in Harlem, in New York, where they said, we're going to do the digital thing, but we're also rooted in this thing. And so they're trying to figure out, how do we build a global social media ecosystem that can be funded and built on top of it? And so, I encourage folks who are listening to this, go back and listen to the interview I did with Rudy, because to me, he's an example of one of these people trying to figure it out.
Let me just contextualize that. In the 1970s, Václav Havel, then a cultural dissident in Czechoslovakia, was asked, how do you make change when you're facing a totalizing system that's not amenable to rational persuasion or civic action? And his answer was, you have to create a parallel polis of horizontal relationships prefiguring the order you want, in which you can speak the truth, act in wholesome ways, not be co-opted, and so on. And I think that this is a very timely reminder in these times when, of course, anything at the national level is shut down right now, and much of the rest, while it may or may not be rigged, it's the affordances of conventional state governance are not so great. And so I think it behooves us in the commons and adjacent communities to try to explore these creating these parallel policies, parallel social economies, the way Rudy is, because that's where we're going to have some emancipation. That's where we're going to have some self-determination and sovereignty. And let's later have some negotiations with the state. We'll help you out with your problems if you let us have some sovereignty over and self-control over our own lives in ways that you've denied us historically. And I think this is especially true for communities like African Americans who've relied upon cooperatives and other forms of commoning to survive, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to me, it's, there is a strong and powerful tradition of the idea of dual power, of the idea in which sometimes you are directly confronting capital and the state and saying, I want you to change, I want you to reforms, I want everything else. But so much of social change has come from the idea that we actually need to build alternative sets of institutions, alternative sets of working, alternative sets of economic relationships. And the digital tools we have now let us do that in ways that are quite exciting if we realize that is what we're doing, that we're not just building something that is directly in opposition. Yes, protesting authoritarianism is a very good thing. Protesting what is going on with ICE and protesting the idea of a Christian nationalist state is important. But the way in which we do that, you have to have a base, a structure of an alternative thing. And, the civil rights movement under Martin Luther King was driven by Black hair salons because they could exist in an economic system that wasn't dependent on white power in the South.
I think there's a whole, you might call it a fugue, that has to go on between social practice and discourse and theory to make sense of it. And it goes back and forth. And I think the discourse and theory is important, one, to have a deeper understanding of what's going on, and two, to generalize it as a cultural phenomenon that we can all relate to and collectively emancipate ourselves. So that I see the commons as a useful strategic discourse, not only in critiquing capitalism, but in being a platform for these creative alternatives of creating value, and doing so in ways that, frankly, represent a different mindset, a different social logic, and can communicate and stand up for that in philosophically rigorous ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Like there's this idea that there is no alternative, or, the only alternative to the Western Silicon Valley model of how the internet works is China. And you're like, well, if I had to choose between Google and Facebook and the Chinese Central Committee and WeChat and Temu, I'm going to choose the Western models because you don't think something else exists. And it writes out the existence of open source. It writes out the existence of internet protocols. It writes out the existence of alternative. And the commons is that model, but we need to show people that it exists. Hannah Arendt's thing of you have to have hope and believable hope that something better can exist. You don't just change the system because of fear of what you have. And
I've tried to develop that through, the standard economics has its cartoon character of Homo economicus, the utility maximizing, rational, selfish materialist. And I was wondering, okay, what does the inner dimensions of a commons look like? And my colleague Silke Helfrich and I, in our book Free, Fair, and Alive, identified more than 24 different what we call patterns of commoning using the pattern language methodology of Christopher Alexander. And these are the activities and behaviors that are bottom-up socially driven, that manifest as recurrent ways that communities solve problems within a common setting. And I think that's my way of trying to articulate this inner landscape that is mostly terra incognita or caricatured as a libertarian individual thing, and the rest is in the code. So in other words, this social space needs to be turned over and opened up. And that requires, in some ways, frankly, that we become more vulnerable to each other and we be more, not to be kind of gushy or squishy about it, because there are patterns. But I think we need to start relating in different ways and thinking relationally and not just individually transactionally.
And in part of that is to make it work on a social media scale. We need what are called gradients of intimacy. Not everything should be out there entirely in the public. That is why we use group chats. That's why we have subreddits. And that's why we have these things, which is saying, in order to be vulnerable, you need to know the social relationship with who you are being vulnerable with. And if you went to go be vulnerable just entirely on the rough and tumble world of Twitter, where everybody is trying to sort of win the game of attention, it doesn't work. So we need to build systems that allow that vulnerability to happen.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. Well, let me ask you, what are some of your hypotheses for how we build those spaces, given how they've been sort of flattened and reduced over time with the other models?
I mean, my hypothesis is that semi-private things need to exist and that we need to build stuff. And so, this gets into part of why I started this podcast and a campaign, which is like, in order to design the social media systems that would allow us to build dual power, allow us to build an alternative commons-based system that we could then model and achieve social change. This is why I end the podcast with, the Subcomandante Marcos quote of, we need a social media revolution to make revolution possible. We need to build a set of systems that let us engage in the creation of social change. And those systems need to have a set of kind of rights. Users, I call this the social media bill of rights. Users need to have ownership of their identity and their social relationships. They need the ability to have privacy and security on these systems. They need to have the right to exit interoperability. This is Cory Doctorow's adversarial interoperability. That's how you deal with enshittification. You need to have algorithmic transparency and choice. What are the algorithms that are facing me? And you need to have self-governance. And this is something we see with Rudy taking the ability of Blue Sky to run your own moderation system and say, these are the moderation rules. These are who are making my decisions. These are, is that me individually just with a web of trust, or is that some person I'm assigning? And if we build these rights into our digital systems, we then build the ability to have human connection, have an alternative economic system that is supportive of it, have an alternative governance system that says we're not dependent on just living in a shopping mall that Mark Zuckerberg provides, or the government censorship of China.
I resonate to everything you just said. I think the missing element so far has been this mutual self-awareness that we can create a different world. And that we're seeing the flexing of muscle in response to the Jimmy Kimmel affair, and how people are starting to say, okay, he's back on the air, but what about those Sinclair and other stations that he's banned from? Let's go after it. I mean, don't we have this collective power that hasn't been acknowledged or the vehicles for mobilizing it? And to the extent that the social media platforms can help give us the sovereignty of we the people that we have nominally but not actually, then we can start to build in the proper directions and have more of a cultural awareness that, hey, we can do this.
No, and that flocking behavior, that collective power was the point of why we created social media in the first place. The whole point was we existed in a world in the 1990s where you had media consolidation and you had a few corporations that had gatekeepers and decided what could happen. And we said, can we use the internet? Can we use tools? Can we use the ability for people to have their own voice to build it out? And we did that. And now we have this massive cacophony, and we need to now learn how to govern that commons, because it doesn't govern itself. We need to do that.
I think that there was a lot of perhaps understandable naivete in those early years that the open platform itself would be liberatory. After all, the corporations were quaking in their boots that their business model was going to be wiped out. And they, of course, were resorting to all sorts of draconian extreme copyright and other responses. But for our part, we believed our own propaganda of John Perry Barlow and others, that we didn't need to have self-protective membranes around ourselves for the value we created, and that the corporations would get wise and could strip mine our communities and shitify them without our even quite realizing what was going on. So there's been this cultural learning process, and I like to think, as the Who said, not going to get fooled again, and that we can maybe devise the techno-legal and social structures for protecting our commons' generativity.
The mobilizations, like the Jimmy Kimmel mobilization that got him back on the air, I think it is also telling the power balance that he didn't know he was going to get restored on the air. He didn't know the movement would work. He didn't know that people canceling their Disney streaming accounts would work. He didn't know the mobilization works. And he was planning on switching to using YouTube, using a podcast, going directly to people. Like, he had that alternative, and the existence of that viable alternative, which meant that when organizations like Disney went and looked at it, they're like, look, he's not totally dependent on us. If we don't bring him back, if we don't respond to this movement that is demanding these things, he will go off and take that audience with him.
Not to mention the brand identities of major corporations were going to suffer a serious hit to their capitalization. And I think that was persuasive as well.
Yeah, I mean, one of the fascinating things is the dynamics around shareholder value. You know, this is something I talked to Jack Dorsey about, which is like, we think of the markets as this monolithic thing. We think of the way in which they work as this sort of one universal monolithic thing, but actually they're incredibly vulnerable to pressure and shareholder value and price and things like that. And not just because they want to make money, but because these corporations use their share price to get access to debt markets that give them capital that keep the companies running. It isn't just taking money away from Elon Musk to have protests against Tesla that reduce Tesla's shareholder value. It actually has fundamental structural effects in these corporations. If you drop the share price, then their ability to operate and run the markets has so much power. And we need to realize our own collective power and our leverages in the system.
I mean, it reminds me of your own indie media experiences. Had the indie media network been able to stick together with a footprint as big as ABC or more, with some of the resources, you know, you start to have a competitive thing that's qualitatively different instead of having to go through these state-captured, capitalized media ventures that are misrepresenting the truth on the news or utterly subordinate to presidential bullying. So, you know, I think the next step in this evolution should be for more decentralized control of resources and businesses. And that's sort of where your indie media was headed. That's where your protocols and Rudy in Black Sky is headed. I think we need to take this further steps.
You know, one of those first steps I would encourage folks to look at is the cashew protocol. It's like, okay, here is a community controlled protocol that lets communities run their own banks, run their own finance systems. And it works in a digital way. And it's not speculative the way a lot of Web 3.0 cryptocurrency stuff ended up being speculative and reproduced every scam in the history of capitalism. So there, you know, it's important to be critical about it, but it's also important to realize that we are participating in it. We are co-designing it. We are co-creating it together. And, you know, democracy isn't a spectator sport. The economy isn't a spectator sport. We are not passive consumers. And the commons gives us this model for an economic and a social system that we run together.
Absolutely right. I would only add that how unitary and omnibus the commons is in your description versus how disaggregated and particularistic it is, I think matters. We've seen, for example, how political parties often get co-opted at the top and sell out. How can these communities be somewhat unitary, organic, and answerable and accountable, as opposed to somebody running off with the crown jewels and betraying the community? Now, I suppose the protocols help a huge amount in that, but to the extent that resources are amassed or a leadership cadre takes charge, there's vulnerabilities there too. So, I mean, I think also of the experiments with the Pirate Party in Europe and the so-called liquid democracy voting protocols and representation. I think we haven't quite yet figured out how some of these coherent, politically significant collectives can hold together and not be captured by charismatic leaders or unscrupulous leaders.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I did a research project called Decent a bunch of years ago on liquid democracy, on the digital systems, on, Podemos in Spain and the Pirate Party in Sweden and Iceland. And it is quite tricky to figure out how to make these digital systems work, how to make this kind of democracy work, how the self-governance work, and how to make it so that it isn't easily corruptible and taken off in a certain direction. You know, Rudy talks about using polis to try and engage democratically in the community that they're running, and so that they have that accountability. And some of it is messy and not, but it's important to realize that if you have no system, then it becomes easily capturable. You have this sort of tyranny of structurelessness. You can't just say, we can't have any governance system. We can't have any set of saying what the rules are. We can't have any kind of, transparency around it because we're all equal. And the internet protocol handles everything. And that even in systems like Bitcoin, which is quite set down in sort of how it's supposed to work, there is very real governance, and it is very social, and it matters. And we can't ignore those power dynamics, and we have to create accountable governance systems in open ways in order to prevent it from being captured.
I absolutely agree. I flash on this book that really was quite important to me, not so much in the digital sense, but in the constitutional sense. This Chilean writer wrote a book called Systemic Corruption Towards an Anti-Oligarchic Order. And she argued quite cogently that we need some organized constitutional forms of plebeian assemblies or representation as part of the structure. Otherwise, it gets corrupted and disintegrates and loses legitimacy. And I think many of those principles, I might add, she invoked such titanic figures as Machiavelli, Hannah Arendt, and Rosa Luxemburg to make this case. And I think that kind of argument needs to apply to our digital constitutionalism, for lack of a better term, that there be some sort of genuine plebeian voice so that different factions or elites cannot capture the system or simply monetize it under the standard business rubrics and run away with it.
Yeah, I mean, so much of the late David Graeber's work is about how do these systems emerge? How can you create them? How can you continue to sustain them? And he went off and studied just to show that they exist, that we know that they exist. The Chilean example is great because, in southern Chile and Argentina, you have the Mapuche people who have this fairly decentralized community-based resistance to colonialism. And I was in southern Chile once talking to this Mapuche guy, and I went up and he had a little teeny roadside stand and he sold like 3 different things. And I asked him if I could have some, if he sold water. And the thing he said to me was so amazing. He's like, water is not for sale. Like, we don't sell water because water is not a thing that is bought and sold. And, we were having this conversation, Mapuche is his language, native language. We were having the conversation in Spanish, but, agua no se vende. Like, it was just this iconic moment of like, oh, that's right. And it was a clash of cultures because, I, in this case, was, a tourist visiting I was living in Uruguay at the time, but relatively developed place visiting this indigenous community. And we were having a conversation and he's just like, look, this isn't a thing that is bought and sold. And he said it in such a matter of fact way.
Well, it reminds me of a friend who was on a trip and somebody helped him out. I think he had a flat tire or something. And he tried to slip him a $20 bill, a 20 euro bill. And the guy was insulted. What? I'm befriending you by helping you, and you're trying to just give me. In other words, let's get back to some of these original notions of human relationship that are not mediated by money or markets, and realize that that's kind of the bedrock from which we have to build.
And we don't ignore the financial systems. We don't ignore the existence of economic incentives, but we realize that they need to be subservient to the social relationships. It is actually, after all, social media, not, monetized media.
Well, I mean, in fact, that is the dirty little secret that the businesses are trying to mystify themselves as friends and family and all the legitimacy that comes from your social connections. And it's just horseshit. It's a business and they're trying to rip and run as much as they can. And so finding the tricky ways of architecting systems to enable and encourage and support these more humane, non-monetary relationships, I think is really the important challenge. And unfortunately, there's a lot of instructive examples out there, but that'll only get you so far in creating, a work of art as software code and figuring out what the social theory is that goes with it.
This has been such a great conversation. I really appreciate your time, all of your work. I would love if you could sort of, for folks who want to learn more about the Commons, want to learn more about your work, want to learn more about how to apply this in their work, thinking about the future of social media, thinking about how it's designed, how do we use it? Where should people go and to learn more?
My primary website blog is Bollier, BOLLIER.org. My recently published second edition, Think Like a Commoner, was published in March this year. That's probably the best popular introduction to the book, to the idea of the Commons. And then there's other books you can find on my websites, many of which are online for free. So I welcome these kind of conversations because, I can only go so far in the tech conversation without topping out in what I know. But I do know the Commons has a lot of potential. I mean, if only because the original protocols for the internet were based upon a gift economy and commoning. And in some ways, we ought to get back to the garden.
The internet that the U.S. military and the U.S. government proposed in the 1950s and 60s was not this commons-based internet. They had this thing called OSI. They wanted a very structured, top-down, regulated thing. And the TCP/IP stack, the thing that gives us the fundamental stacks upon which the web is built, is actually a community-created, commons-governed alternative to the thing the state tried to impose. And we forget that. We think of, the U.S. military funded this thing and they gave us the internet. But the internet they wanted to create isn't the internet that the academics and activists built, the one that has changed the world. Knowing this history, knowing about the Commons, knowing about this alternative, and that the Commons exists as a very real functioning alternative to just private or state ownership of these things. And it's the thing that has been most universally sort of embedded in human history. It's the normal going back thousands of years. And this idea of state sovereignty or private ownership, those are the new things.
So, let's get to the noosphere. Let's try to get the architecture that can get us there. And I really appreciate this conversation, Rabble. It's been really turned over a lot of useful threads, I think, to build on. So thank you for having me.
Thanks again to David Bollier for coming on Revolution.Social. Our intro and outro music is a remix of the Italian anti-fascist song Bella Ciao, courtesy of White Records.
This episode was edited and produced by Eric Johnson from lightningpod.fm. Our executive producer is me, Alice Chan, from Flock Marketing.
To learn more about the Social Media Bill of Rights and sign up for our email newsletter, visit Revolution.Social.
For more interviews like this one, follow Revolution.Social on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Nostos, Fountain.fm, or wherever you get your podcasts.
And to paraphrase the Zapatista Subcomandante Marcos, we need a social media revolution to make revolution possible. We'll be back next week. See you then.